casting their vote in Eastern Ukraine.
Так звані вибори в окупованих районах Донецької та Луганської областей, що самопроголошений день.
Controversial elections organized by pro-Russian groups.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we've been tracking this week. Eastern Ukraine is an ideological battlefield, and the Fourth Estate has been weaponized. Tunisia gave birth to the Arab Spring. Its media are experiencing growing pains. Egyptian editors pledged their allegiance to the army, but will their journalists march in step? Plus, some classical, if not quite classic, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Typically, when an election is held, news editors send reporters out to cover them. With the elections in eastern Ukraine this past week, many news outlets sent no one at all, either for reasons of safety or because they did not want their coverage to confer legitimacy on elections that they consider illegitimate. Many of those news organizations are based in Kiev, in western Ukraine, and they echoed the official line of the government there, a view that's also held in many Western capitals. The media coverage coming out of Russia, however, told a completely different story, and there was a lot of it. This is the latest chapter in the propaganda war that pits the Kremlin against Kiev and its Western allies. Moscow is also making changes to the media in Russia. The parliament there has recently passed a law limiting to 20% the stake that any foreign investor can hold in Russian media companies. And the Kremlin's soft power push got another nudge late last month with the expansion of RT, Russia's 24-hour global news network, which has just launched a separate channel aimed specifically at the UK. This is a media story that's moving fast on many fronts, including Moscow, Kiev, and London. But our starting point this week is eastern Ukraine and the self-declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk.
The narratives are so different that it's hard to believe that both sides are talking about the same event.
Донбасс сделал свой выбор.
Донбасс больше не является частью Украины.
Basically, the Russian narrative is that the elections are legitimate and they are legal. The Western and the Ukrainian narrative is that these elections are illegal.
Вийшли із протестом проти фарсу і цирку, який влаштувала Росія.
It's really crucial for the Russians to feel that their narrative is getting through, and that's why they're investing so much money into it on the international stage.
Despite sporadic fire, hundreds of thousands still turned out to cast their ballots.
I think the question is whether ethical journalism is possible in the global age, and what sort of reports can we get from a country that we know so little about.
What news consumers are getting on this story, most of them, is what they want to hear, as opposed to what they need to know. If you are a Ukrainian living in the East, loyal to Moscow, the Russian media and news outlets in eastern Ukraine will simply reinforce your point of view. If you are a Ukrainian loyal to Kiev, or an outsider with a Western bias, there are plenty of news outlets speaking your language. They act, in effect, as echo chambers, reverberating with the familiar, comfortable places that will not challenge your beliefs.
In Russia, the Russian media is winning the propaganda war for a very simple reason. You know, when the Russian television shows people whose houses were destroyed, people sympathize with these people because the victims also speak Russian. We identify with these victims very easily. So in Russia, the Russian media is winning the propaganda war. In Ukraine, it looks like the Ukrainian media was pretty successful also.
Ukrainian headlines included all the words like fake elections, pseudo-elections, and this kind of things, while Russian headlines were legitimate election, free will of people, and so on.
The shortcomings of the Russian media, the Kremlin's increasing control, the rampant self-censorship, particularly on the broadcast side, is well documented. Ukraine's media are less notorious, but in some ways they have borrowed from Moscow's playbook, right down to the recent creation of Ukraine Today. The oligarch-owned news channel is clearly modeled on the state-owned RT that broadcasts out of Moscow and used to be known as Russia Today.
It was awaited with great anticipation in the outside world. I think that many of them are satisfied that they have now this point of view of Ukrainians in English abroad. Of course, there are a few questions that remain. First, it is owned by a big oligarch. Second question, it's also its name. If the aim of the channel is to provide a balanced coverage, then maybe you shouldn't call yourself with a name similar to Russia Today.
Ukrainian media is extremely one-sided and anti-Russian now. They also have state-controlled media stations, and then of course the new president Petro Poroshenko owns a media outlet himself. He's an oligarch, he's a tycoon. He also sees the importance of the media, which is why he's so keen to keep control of his TV channel. So one shouldn't have the impression that the media position in Ukraine is a great liberal sort of panorama of alternative views.
The Putin era has coincided with a slow, steady erosion of media freedom in Russia. A slide that accelerated earlier this year when the pro-EU anti-Russian demonstrations erupted in Kiev. Last month, the Russian parliament passed a new law limiting foreign ownership in Russian media companies to 20%. Coverage in the Western media routinely characterized that law as President Putin exerting even more control over the media. What those stories tend to leave out is that Canada, Australia, and Brazil all have similar laws limiting foreign ownership to between 20 and 30%. But no one calls those governments draconian, just Russia's.
Well, many countries, including Western ones, control the amount of foreign investment in their media, because media is so incredibly important. So Russia is not unique in trying to limit the amount of foreign ownership. The main media outlets have always been controlled by the Kremlin or by oligarchs who are close to the Kremlin, with one or two exceptions. So it's not a healthy media scene, but as I say, the Ukrainian war has not made that any worse, but it's been used in the West as sort of yet another stick to beat Putin.
First of all, it's a way of nationalizing media in the Russian Federation. And I think it is part of a larger project of the current government to nationalize the industry, to nationalize the financial capitals, to nationalize political elites. So in many ways, that move regulates just one area of public life in the Russian Federation. Looking at it another way, we can say that this is definitely a way to make a media more obedient in the current context by enforcing certain ownership rights on the Russian market.
If you look at the quality newspapers, you will see that 80% of them are very critical of the attitude of the Russian government during the conflict in Ukraine. I can name you several newspapers, daily newspapers: Коммерсант, Независимая газета, Московский комсомолец, to name just the three biggest and most respected newspapers. I can also add Ведомости, which is a Russian analog of Financial Times. All of these newspapers were very critical of the attitudes of Mr. Putin and the Russian government to the conflict in Ukraine.
Ведомости, in particular, may be in the Kremlin's crosshairs. It's a financial paper partly owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Vedomosti's coverage of Russian commerce, the oligarchs, and their ties with the government may have made it even more enemies in the Kremlin than did its coverage of Ukraine. And Moscow is upping the ante on the airwaves, spreading the word.
News from around the UK for the UK.
RT's new channel, RT UK, is designed to change hearts and minds in Britain. The overall RT network is getting the kind of budget hike, 30%, that most Western networks would kill for. It has plans to start news channels in German and French. This is an all-out media war, and make no mistake, it's escalating no matter what happens in Ukraine. On the download this week, viewer feedback on the coverage of the story in eastern Ukraine.
Conflict between Ukraine and Russia is also certainly an information war, and it's really tricky to say who's winning. Russia certainly wins by volume because it's flooded all possible information channels with propaganda and manipulation. On the other hand, Ukrainian media enjoy more trust because Russian state media have completely discredited themselves in Western eyes.
I think RT is so present in the West precisely because most viewers are unaware of the actual situation on the ground, and seem to believe this mixture of propaganda, conspiracy theories, and anti-Western sentiment.
We're always open to viewer feedback and ideas. If you've got an opinion on the news media, just go to our Facebook or Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @AJListeningPost. Fire up your camera, make a worthwhile point, hit send, and we'll see you on the download. Here are some other stories that are on our radar this week. In Egypt, the divide between journalists supporting the El-Sisi government and those who do not is growing wider. There was an extraordinary statement published October 26th, shortly after an attack which killed 33 soldiers in Sinai. Signed by editors and some journalists from 17 media outlets, the authors said they would refrain from criticizing all state institutions, including the police and the army. But a week later, more than 300 journalists, including members of Egypt's journalists' union, signed an online petition rejecting that statement, saying it does not distinguish between fighting terrorism and initiating a new fascism. Their statement said, the terrorists will win when they can control the media, and the state will fall when it agrees on the same goal. Confronting terrorism is a duty and an honor, and it has nothing to do with the nationalization of the press or the voluntary abandonment of freedom of speech. That new startup, bankrolled by eBay founder Pierre Omidyar, has had its first high-profile departure. Matt Taibbi appears to be heading back to Rolling Stone magazine. Taibbi made his journalistic name through investigative work on U.S. politics and some scathing critiques of Wall Street's relationship with Washington. He, Glenn Greenwald, and Jeremy Scahill were the biggest names to jump to Omidyar's First Look Media. Taibbi was hired to run a satirical magazine called The Racket, which is yet to get off the ground. First Look has launched its hard news site. It's called The Intercept, and it published an article on Taibbi as well as problems at The Intercept itself. The piece, co-written by Greenwald and Scahill, among others, revealed that Omidyar and his management team had imposed a confounding array of rules and exercised arbitrary and excessive authority, including personally signing off on employee taxi receipts. The article states that most of those problems have since been resolved, but that the writers have learned it is much easier to talk about high-minded abstract principles than it is to construct an organization around them. Rolling Stone has confirmed that Matt Taibbi is currently working on a piece for the magazine, but it has yet to go any further by announcing that he's back on board full-time. There's a dispute brewing in Kosovo, allegations of corruption and intimidation involving the European Union's body there and a local newspaper reporter. Vebi Kaitazi is an investigative journalist at a newspaper called Koa Ditore. Late last month, he published a series of telephone transcripts that allegedly exposed corruption within EULEX. That's the EU body that is working in Kosovo, including one exchange apparently revealing a judge arranging a bribe. The transcripts were reportedly leaked to the newspaper by a former EULEX prosecutor turned whistleblower, Maria Bamia. Kaitazi says that prior to publication, he asked EULEX for a comment and was invited to a meeting where he was asked to hand over his information, and he refused. He says he was later told he could be facing prosecution if he wrote about the case. The newspaper's editor, Agron Bayrami, says it's not the first time the newspaper's been threatened, but it was the first time that such pressure came from the EU. EULEX denies the allegation, calls it a misunderstanding between the mission and the reporter. That's a characterization that the paper has rejected outright. Tunisia is known as the birthplace of the Arab Spring, and given what has unfolded since in Egypt and Libya, it's one of the post-revolution success stories. The country has just voted for the second time since the fall of President Ben Ali in January of 2011. It just held parliamentary elections. The presidential vote comes up later this month. The media landscape there is almost unrecognizable, with a host of new outlets operating under a new set of rules, all of which sounds good in theory, but in reality, the Tunisian media market is oversaturated with outlets, many of which look economically unsustainable. As a result, news organizations have come to rely on political funding, which happens under the table for survival. That's never a good formula, particularly in an election year. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Tunis on the media there, the high expectations that Tunisians had of them, and whether those expectations are being met.
Ask Tunisians, what are the biggest changes since the fall of President Zine Abidine Ben Ali on January 14, 2011, and they will tell you it's media freedom. And you can see it. On the newsstands, on the airwaves, online, Tunisia is talking.
The public realm erupted with people who once didn't have the right to express themselves freely, and who finally came to bring a different rhetoric to what existed in the past.
We can see all political opinions being portrayed on TV. Ideologies ranging from the far right to the far left. This is something that we didn't see before. The ruling party's opposition, people openly criticizing the government.
That government, until it stepped down in January this year, was the Troika coalition led by the Nahda party, which advocated for Islam to play a greater role in Tunisian politics and society. A vision that did not sit well with the secular opposition and its media apparatus. Channels like Nesma TV, which existed under Ben Ali, and Tunisia attacked the government in scathing critiques and heated debates on talk shows.
الناس هذوما إلى كفار ومؤمنين وحطوا أرواحهم واستغفر الله في بلاصة الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Troika and its supporters reacted by setting up channels of their own like Mutawassat, Zitwan, and the religious channel TNN, which say that they are out to counterbalance what is being said on opposition channels. Tunisia's media were no longer censored, they were polarized.
It was at this moment that we could detect the start of a conflict between those who wanted to reinforce freedom of speech with clear, definable regulations, and those who followed what I call a culture inherited from the past. I am the strongest, therefore I will impose my viewpoint on the media landscape.
Mon point de vue dans l'espace médiatique.
Let me say that press freedom in Tunisia is only nascent. From what we have seen at the beginning of the revolution, we can say there was an apparent lack of discipline, ethics, and absolute freedom. The state was weak, which in turn gave the journalists a large margin of freedom.
When regimes fall, the media tend to burgeon, and usually at a rate that outpaces the necessary regulatory framework. That's what's happened in Tunisia. In the Ben Ali era, there were 5 television stations. Today, there are 17. But many are owned or funded by political parties or by businessmen with close ties to those political parties. And the coverage on offer to Tunisians ahead of the elections is often far too partial. We spoke to voters to gauge how useful they have found the new privately owned media outlets going into the election.
والله نحاول شوية من فيسبوك شوية انترنت يعني ما نتبعش ياسر تلفزيون خاطر ما نحسوش الكل صادق هكا كي جاو يعطيو في الصحيح نجم نختار بكل سهولة تامة
لازمك تعرف شنو تختار ومانا سورس دانفورماسيون فهمت خاطر فما برشا معناتها مثلا تلفز ولا اذاعات هما متحزبين هذوك الحقيقه معناتها ما يكونوش كريديبل برشا وما تكونش معناتها الانفورماسيون نتاعهم صحيحه 100% اكثر منها معناتها باش تخدم مصلحه انتخابيه نتاع طرف على حساب طرف اخر.
To deal with that, the government set up a new regulator called the High Independent Authority of Audiovisual Communication, known as HICA. It set new regulations for media coverage during the electoral campaign, but has struggled to exert its authority over some channels. Hannibal and Nesma TV, 2 of the 3 privately owned channels licensed under Ben Ali, have refused to comply with the new regulations and are yet to renew their licenses. This is not the first controversy that Nesma TV has faced. In 2012, the channel's director, Nabil Karoui, was convicted of disturbing public order and violating moral values after broadcasting an animated film called Persepolis that some religious leaders say insulted Islam. He was hit with a small fine. Karoui makes no secret of his secular bias. He doesn't like HICA's new regulations and, it appears, does not respect the authority.
No one of them worked one day in TV or in a radio station. They don't understand. The ICA came and said, okay, we have to treat all the people who are participating in the election in the same way. Maybe I don't like Islamists or I don't like communists. Okay, I'm a private media. I can have my opinion. And I'm happy to have other media who have the opinion contrary to me. Let me tell you how it doesn't work. We have 50 candidates for the presidentielle. If I had to treat the 50 in the same way, maybe I have to launch 3 channels opening them only for these guys. How I can do that? It's impossible.
Les petits médias sont obligés de se soumettre.
Small media have to submit because they don't have the means to oppose Haika. But media of the old regime, at least those created under the old regime, still want to impose their own rules on the advertising issue, on the electoral debate issue, on the balance issue, on the hate speech, which is sometimes broadcast on TV.
Des fois propagé sur certaines télés.
Ce n'est pas l'Haïka contre les journalistes.
It's not Haika against journalists or Haika against freedom of speech. That is not what we're about. This conflict is between a minority of media owners who had privileges during Ben Ali's reign and who want to continue to act outside the regulatory framework.
Ostensibly, this conflict boils down to money, influence, and what many see as a sense of entitlement among media that existed under Ben Ali. Haika says it's trying to separate media and politics by removing the money. According to its new regulations, political parties can't own, fund, even advertise on television. But in an election year, politicians need the exposure. And in the new commercially driven market, the media need the money. So in effect, Haika has not succeeded in stopping politicians throwing money at the media. It's just not happening above board.
They said, no way that there is a political advertisement. The party find themselves, they have to pay under the table, moving things, buying some media, buying journalists, etc., because it's not transparent. And I said to them, you will always have money in the ground. Make it transparent.
L'argent sale, entre guillemets.
Dirty money has really polluted the media landscape in Tunisia and created a lot of connivance between a certain class of business people with corrupt motives and these TV channels who clearly have political agendas. And this influx of money in the media has exacerbated the problem of credibility.
Under the old regime, censorship prevented the media from serving in the public's interest. Today, to a lesser degree, political money and influence do the same thing. The revolution brought the Tunisian media their freedom. The one thing, despite all that political money, that most news outlets cannot buy, here in the birthplace of the Arab Spring, is journalistic credibility.
For those looking for alternative media outlets in Tunisia, on the television side, there's Telvza TV. Launched a year ago, it's a collective owned partially by journalists who work there, and no investor can own more than a 3% stake. That model is designed to ensure editorial independence, but is it sustainable? Telvza is still broadcasting, but it's struggling to compete and has been losing viewership. Then there are alternative news sources that are online. Nawat.org is a 10-year-old independent collective blog publishing primarily in Arabic and in French. It provided a platform for some dissident voices under Ben Ali, but was only accessible to a tech-savvy few since the website was blocked by the regime until the day after it fell. Then there's Inkifada.com, launched in June of this year by a former staffer at Nawat. It publishes in French and references its sources thoroughly, providing readers with links to source material. Finally, those who want their news in English tend to go to Tunisia Live. It's an independent multimedia site which also does work for international news channels, including Al Jazeera. Tunisia Live launched in April of 2011, just after the revolution. And finally, from our news set here at Al Jazeera's brand new London Broadcast Centre, have you ever eaten one of those chili peppers that leaves you sweating and in tears? Now, imagine downing a Carolina Reaper, that's a chili pepper reputed to be the hottest pepper anywhere, and then trying to play a clarinet or a French horn. That's what the Danish National Chamber Orchestra did at the behest of a chili pepper aficionado named Chili Klaus, by the way. He thought it would be fun to feed classical musicians one of those Carolina Reapers, then get them to play a number and throw the result up on YouTube. What we leave you with is the sound of wind instruments burning. And we'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
Tunisia.